Well, in case you haven't figured it out by now, I love doing this. Playing with older or underutilized exotics and testing them out in the current sandbox is one of my favorite things to do in Destiny, and it's even better when I actually have a good reason to do so. With the generous 25% damage increase versus red bars and majors that auto rifles received a few weeks back, I figured the primary bullet hose of Destiny 2, Sweet Business, was worth another look. And if I'm gonna dive into a weapon, I figure I might as well take it the whole way. Utility, performance, damage, PvP, PvE, we're going in for the full rundown, starting out with the stats and perks. Sweet Business is an exotic kinetic auto rifle whose fire rate starts out at 360 rounds per minute with a 150 round magazine. For the stats, they're not exactly a thing of beauty. I mean, the aim assist is solid, the recoil direction is maxed out at 100, and it does have surprisingly good airborne effectiveness at 32. And while the stability sitting at 55 is acceptable, we are a little light in the range department with the handling and reload speed coming in with terrible stat values. Sweet Business's intrinsic trait is Payday. Larger mag size, increased accuracy when hip firing, and picking up a special or heavy brick immediately reloads the weapon. Sweet Business's exotic perk is Business Time. Holding down the trigger will boost both the range and the rate of fire. And once you have the catalyst unlocked, when the weapon is fully spun up, the amount of flinch you'll receive is greatly reduced. And with that, just a few functionality aspects to touch on next. Sweet Business is going to start out firing at 360 rounds per minute. It does gradually ramp up, and after the 12th round is fired, we hit our max 900 round per minute fire rate. And once we get into the PvP section, we'll check in on what kind of range increase we're gaining with that as well. For the base reload speed, we are looking at a very lengthy 3.77 seconds. But with the large mag size and the auto reloading on special and heavy brick pickups, hopefully you won't have to endure that very often. But that's pretty much it. Let's move on to the damage numbers, but do keep in mind,
PvE damage numbers are variable and will change depending on content scaling and enemy tier. For the sake of consistency, I started doing all of my testing in the Spire of the Watcher dungeon at the Akalos encounter. This will hopefully provide you with more relevant data, while keeping the damage numbers collected comparable from video to video.
So, versus Akalos, Sweet Business is seeing 1,310 points of damage on a crit and 935 to the body. If every shot in the 150 round magazine does land as a crit, we'll be looking at 196,500 points of damage. I have the time to empty clocked at 10.61 seconds, which puts the single mag damage per second at 18,520. So, not too bad for a primary weapon. You could definitely do worse, but it's still not something you'd want to rely on for serious boss damage if you don't have to. Versus a major tier enemy, where we now start seeing that 25% damage improvement, a crit is dealing 1,852, and a body is registering for 1,321. Maximum single mag damage in this case, 277,800. With the single mag DPS sitting at 26,183. Versus the red bar harpies and goblins in the encounter, we see crits dealing 2,592 points of damage and 1,849 on body shots. And for these DPS figures that you're seeing, you do need to take into account, because those numbers are calculated for a full magazine, and because the weapon does have a decreased fire rate when it's not fully spun up, they can and will shift around somewhat in-game. If Sweet Business is already humming when you start to focus on a target, they're gonna be a little bit better. And a little bit worse on a cold start versus enemies who are gonna die out before that full magazine is expended. It's kinda common sense, but just something to consider. And while I don't usually do this because I like to approach my weapon breakdowns from a class neutral perspective, here you go Titans, a gift from me to you. With the Actium Warvig exotic chest piece, you can fire Sweet Business for... you know what, this might be a good time to ask. If you have been enjoying the video thus far, please remember to leave it a like. Or even think about subscribing to the channel if you're not already. With YouTube being my hobby and not my job, I can't promise a flood of fresh videos every week, but when I do release one, I try to present accurate and concise information to the best of my ability. If that's something you want to see more of, you know what to do. But hey, here we are. 29.41 seconds for the time to empty. I'm figuring that's right around 420 bullets fired. And if we look at that in terms of boss damage, that's up over 550,000 points of damage dealt without reloading. Not much changes in the DPS numbers obviously, but still, that is a healthy chunk of total damage. For Sweet Business's performance in PvE, this has always been a weapon that I thought felt more powerful than it actually was. And while no, it's not a boss melter, primaries aren't generally meant to fill that role. They're ad clearing weapons. And with 25% more damage versus red bars and majors, Sweet Business does feel like it's doing that job more efficiently. Its stream of bullets removes trash ads from the field very quickly, which it always has. But now you're spending less time focusing down healthier red bar or major tier targets, letting you snap onto the next enemy a bit quicker. And I think perhaps an underrated aspect of this weapon is the armor piercing rounds. We have an extremely high volume of bullets that can pass clean through enemies, which really does go a long way in shredding up packs of ads, even though you might not even realize it's happening. Plus, if you do get the chance to try it out within the next few weeks, Overload Auto on this thing does a nice job versus champions. Just within a single base magazine, you can disrupt the Overload champion twice. If you're not a Warwig Titan, you'll probably be out of bullets just after the second stun is secured. But hey, I mean, that's why we carry multiple weapons, and it should be an easy cleanup at that point. I certainly do still have some issues with Sweet Business though. The reload speed is painfully long. It will auto-reload when collecting ammo bricks, but you do need to be able to physically collect that ammo. If your special and heavy weapon are maxed out on reserves, no auto-reload. And it gets a little more tricky if you're running double primaries. Collecting special ammo bricks isn't even going to be an option. So that results in even less opportunities in getting that instant magazine refresh. In this situation, being able to negate the reload through some exotic or class ability almost feels necessary. Or at the very least, some loader mods on your arms. Then handling's really low, contributing to the weapon's overall sluggish feel. Then the need for the weapon to spin up to deal respectable damage can be a bit of a nuisance. Not so much when you're fighting off large groups, but when enemies are a bit more spread out, the weapon chugging along at that 360 RPM fire rate just doesn't feel good. Then the range isn't really anything to write home about. It's not an auto rifle that's going to stretch out past mid-range engagements. But when you pair that lower range stat with the average stability, it can feel pretty tough to consistently land crits out near the edges of its optimal range. So if you do want to try this weapon out in, say, high-end Nightfalls, you might want to assess the strike that you're taking it into on a case-by-case basis. But in general, even as a Warlock, I always have enjoyed using this weapon, and it's good to see it performing a bit better now in PvE. Moving on to the Crucible, and starting out with the damage numbers. We're looking at 22 points of damage on a crit, and 16 points of damage to the body. On screen. As always, these numbers are generally rounded up from lesser values, but in this case I think they are rounded pretty aggressively. I'm figuring the true damage is probably a lot closer to 21 and 15, but either way. Versus a Guardian running tier 6 resilience or less, you can down them with 7 crits and 3 body shots. 7 or higher, you're going to have to go 8 and 2 to hit your optimal time to kills. Now for the time to kills, I got you as close as I could by both frame timing and figuring things mathematically, but that ramping fire rate did complicate matters. They might not be perfect, but they should be pretty darn close. So if you're cold firing the weapon, your optimal time to kill should be in the neighborhood of 1.33 seconds. But if the weapon's already spun up to its 900 RPM fire rate, you could down an opposing Guardian in as little as 0.6 seconds. An absolutely massive difference in kill speeds. When looking at body shots, 13 rounds will be required to down a Guardian at tier 7 resilience or less. Any higher than that, you are going to need an extra round. So on a cold start, best case scenario, I'm figuring your time to kill is going to be about 1.56 seconds, 1.63 versus high tier resilience Guardians. If already spun up though, you can drop an opposing player in as little as 0.8 seconds with all body shots, or still a very solid 0.87 seconds versus tier 8 or higher. Versus supers, provided you're already spun up, you will stand a pretty decent chance. Versus a roamer, if you do land all your crits, you might be able to drop them in roughly 1.33 seconds with 19 rounds expended. Give or take. If you're bold enough to challenge a Well of Radiance, as long as you can put that torrent of bullets in the enemy's face, you stand a chance of downing them in about 2.2 seconds. You can pull it off with body shots, it's just going to take much longer, more in the neighborhood of 5.3 seconds. For the physical range, on a cold start, Sweet Business can hit for full damage from up to 25 meters away. But thanks to the range boost, when your weapon is fully spun, you'll get an extra 5 meters, now seeing damage fall off past the 30 meter mark. For Sweet Business's performance in PvP, I'm gonna level with you and say I was really close to giving up on this weapon after a few matches. But I knew in the past I could get it going, and while it did take some work, I was able to turn it around. And there's one rule that you have to follow with Sweet Business. Never engage when not spun up. You need to take advantage of the weapon's greatest strength and avoid its massive flaw, which are one and the same, the time to kills. This weapon can achieve some of the fastest kill speeds in the game when spun up. If you're cold firing, they are some of the worst. So when rounding a corner, moving into a lane, entering an area, if there's even a possibility that an enemy could be there staring back at you, those barrels better be spinning. If they are, you will absolutely shred your enemy. But even with those potentially very fast time to kills, raw aggression isn't always this weapon's best friend. It can be sometimes, but patience and positioning can be the play as well. If you're able to bait an enemy into challenging you, and you can somewhat anticipate their movement, you can have that stream of bullets headed their way before they even have time to react. And due to that large magazine size, if you can get the drop on a group of enemies, you have plenty of firepower to blindside them all in short order. Plus, while it may not be ideal versus supers, if you stand your ground, you at least have a shot of taking them out. And I gotta say, when I did get things going with Sweet Business, it felt like such an amazing weapon. But, there are some major drawbacks to using it. Your cold fire time to kills are kind of a given. They're terrible. And I talked about never engaging when not spun up, but sometimes you won't have a choice. Maybe an enemy closes in on you quick. There's an invisible hunter that your radar didn't ping. You start taking fire from behind. I mean, you get the idea. It happens. And it's very bad for Sweet Business. Not only is it outgunned by nearly every weapon in the game, but the handling is abysmal. So quickly returning fire is not really a viable option, and if you're trying to switch to your off weapon, you might be dead before the animation finishes. Then the muzzle flash, and yeah, I didn't miss looking at that. Sweet Business is already a pretty chunky gun that hogs up some on-screen real estate, and then you got that muddying the screen up a little bit more. Then the reload speed, as we saw, extremely slow and requires a lot of downtime to physically put more rounds in the weapon. And while collecting special bricks does auto-reload the magazine, like we talked about earlier, double primary users are kinda stuck. And last point, as soon as you start firing this weapon in your initial engagement, you have just announced to every player in the match, hey, I'm using Sweet Business. The sound is unmistakable. It is loud, you can hear it from the other side of the map. So while I really don't see many people using Sweet Business in the Crucible these days, don't expect to keep that element of surprise for very long. But what do you think? I know I have some Sweet Business enthusiasts floating around the channel. How's that 25% damage increase working out for you in PvE? And how's Sweet Business landing for you in the Crucible given the current sandbox? Are you able to put it to good use, or is it just a bit too cumbersome in the Immortal SMG meta? Let me know in the comments. But that's gonna do it for me. You guys are awesome, and I will catch you on the next one.